in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Saber, and I'm thrilled to bring you to the fourth in our Fundraising Masters series, which we started this year. And I'm tickled to have Tony Elischer here today. He is an internationally known consultant and expert on fundraising and communications and such, and we're lucky to have him with us today. Just a teeny bit of housekeeping before I introduce Andrea, our co founder, who will then talk with Tony. We are recording this today. Everyone who registered will get a link to that recording later this afternoon. At that time, we will also send you a PDF of the slides, so you will have those. If you've got questions, please type them in that questions box on the right. We'll take them as we go along and certainly at the end, and we encourage questions. If you're having any technical difficulties with the sound, you might want to toggle back and forth between telephone and your headset or internal speakers, because sometimes that can get funky through GoToWebinar, and it's no fault of yours or ours. That's it. I want to quickly turn it over to Andrea, and thank you all for being with us today. Andrea?
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and so exciting to have Tony Elischer for our next Fundraising Masters series. Those of you who were with us for Tom Ahern know that Tom was so excited that Tony was doing this. I don't think he does. Tony doesn't do it often, and is really brings a different take on a different way of looking at the fundraising world than most of us have. Here's what we have to sort of kick off this conversation about Tony. First of all, you should know that Tony is a fantastic globetrotter. He's based in London. Is that right? Or Oxford? Where are you, Tony? I mean, you're here in New York today, but generally, where is your company?
Good question, Andrew. I mean, I think my company is mainly at 39,000 feet bouncing around the world, but our offices are in the middle of England near Oxford. And of course, when anybody talks about England, they think everybody lives in London. But, we do actually get out into the countryside as well.
Right, I stepped right into that, didn't I?
You did, but carry on. You're doing brilliantly.
Carry on. So Tony literally is a globetrotter. He was just telling Brian and me how last week he's going to Switzerland and he's going to Toronto. I don't know how he lives at 39,000 feet, but he does. It's fantastic. That gives him, of course, a much broader view of fundraising than most of us who sit here in the United States get. So we're going to ask him some about that. Tony is a creative strategist. He works for very large companies, these great big INGOs, UNICEF and Save the Children and places like that. And he also works for community-based organizations and more local organizations in Great Britain. He's what I call a status quo shaker-upper. And those of you who were at the International AFP meeting, was it last year, Tony? I guess in Toronto.
Yes.
You will remember his performance, the performance that he organized as they go off to the event. He is doing the same sort of performance in Texas at the AFP next spring, I think it is, in March. Is that right? And so anyone who's tempted to go to the San Antonio International AFP conference, this would be a great reason to do it. Tony, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So happy to have you here. Tony, I thought we'd begin by having you talk a little about your experience as a globetrotter, as a global fundraiser, talking about really what's the same, what's different, what do you see going on around the world in terms of fundraising and philanthropy?
I guess it's a great place to start, Andrea, because I mean, I've been a fundraiser now for 32 years, and I guess during that time, I've really seen this sort of emergence of true global fundraising. Because if you go back and you think about the origins of what we do, in Europe, we sort of really gave birth to philanthropy and to giving. And of course, North America is the absolute home and a mothership to professional fundraising, and has given the world so many techniques and so much sort of thinking and focus. But what's really happened in the last 20 years, and it is that sort of time period, is what we've seen is that so many other markets have actually sort of leapt in and realized the power of fundraising, and they've actually started to say, well, you know, what we need to do is try and find things that are culturally appropriate to us, and we need to take the best thinking, and we need to say, well, how can fundraising work to develop our civil society, our communities? So in the early days of that 20 years ago, you would always think about the global south, and then of course we started to call it the developing world, and nowadays we talk about emerging markets. But I mean, to be quite honest, I don't think that term's going to be around for very long, because if you believe any of the sort of the books and the papers and the thinking around the world is flat, we now look at this idea that says the emerging markets in 5 years will have emerged. And therefore, you know, fundraising is going at a frightening rate. I mean, in fact, as I go around the world, what I find now is that, you know, if you really want stimulation, if you really want to see what's happening, you have to look outside North America, you have to look outside the United Kingdom, and you have to start to say, well, what's happening in some of the emerging markets in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in India. And I would also say, for people who are sort of interested in the wider global picture, you know, everyone's been talking for years about the BRIC countries, and we've been talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China. But in a way, that's been a little bit of a mythical thing, because you see there's so many more markets now that people are investing in. And the INGOs, the international organizations, of course, they have the resources, and they've been actually looking to go into these markets. They've been setting up test programs, and where they've actually found some results and success, they've very rapidly gone in there and grown those markets. So, you know, what we're now seeing is, if you're a fundraiser and you've got this sort of professionalism of skills that you get in North America, then, you know, those skills are very sort of adaptable and transferable, because fundraisers now are probably one of the world's greatest sort of shortages in terms of professions, because there's just not enough of us to go round, which is good news for all the fundraisers on this call.
That's interesting. Tony, let me ask you this. Does that mean that if I were, for example, to go to Poland, picking a country here, and try to market my skills, or if I were a young fundraiser trying to market professional skills in Poland, would people be interested in someone from the United States with that set of skills?
It's a great question, Andrea, because I'm going to sort of balance between all the different nationalities now, because you see, the thing is that, you know, America is the home of professional fundraising. And when I became a fundraiser 32 years ago, I was told, get yourself over to America. And I was sent into the alumni department of Princeton for 6 months to learn the trade. But the big thing I would say is that nowadays, yes, as a professional fundraiser, you could go into Poland, but actually the number one lesson that every fundraiser has to learn when you go into another country is you have to basically use your eyes and your ears more than your mouth. And that is because every culture is very distinct. Philanthropy exists in every culture. If you believe the best in people, that people will give, if you get the right inspiration, if you get the right process. So the direct marketing skills you have would very much adapt in Poland. But I guess the thing now that we're getting much more sophisticated about is every single country, no matter how close they are together, has to have their own adaptation and their own mix to actually come up with successful fundraising.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that is so embedded in this culture here in the United States is not only the knowledge of fundraising, but the culture of philanthropy, of giving. Right? Do you find that must vary country to country?
No, I don't think it does, because again, you know, without sort of going into the history of fundraising generally, I mean, you know, you think about philanthropy and you think about faith, and so much is driven by, obviously, every religion in the world has got philanthropy embedded in it, and that idea of sharing and giving and addressing the less fortunate in society. So, you know, that's there. You've just got to find it, and you've got to draw it out and connect to it. And I think that, you know, you're right. It's not just professional fundraising in North America. I mean, you know, I think North America is also one of the sort of the absolute leaders when it comes to community, which I know we'll talk about later, and the way that people give time and the way that people actually sort of, you know, they build these communities to support each other. So I think that there's an awful lot that we can learn as we go into different markets, and I think that's the beauty. Every market we learn something. I mean, one of the most humbling things I always find now is when I sort of have to go back to, I mean, I was in India 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I have to go back to the very basics and actually teach the basics. But once they master the basics, then you sort of get a country like India that then leaps right over, almost leapfrogs over sort of series of learnings to actually go right to the cutting edge. So it takes the basics, it makes you revisit that, and it says, well, actually, we can take this forward and take the learning from other countries.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me to think about living a life like yours and really being able to listen to how these things apply to other communities. I mean, one of the things that's happened also in the world is that the way we connect person to person has shifted. And I know you've done a lot of thinking about what community means. How do you see that, Tony?
Well, I'm glad we sort of focus on this because this is one of my real sort of hobby horses at the moment, and for good reason. You see, the thing for me is that I started as a community fundraiser. As a young guy coming out of university, I had to work on events and I had to do schools fundraising, collections, sales, all these sort of things. And it was real groundwork stuff. I was given an area and you work that area. And then over the sort of different decades I've had the privilege of being in fundraising, we've sort of started to get diverted, and we're much more interested in all these sort of sexy methods of fundraising, all of the ins and outs of direct marketing, corporate fundraising, high net worth, all these things, which of course are absolutely invaluable. But the thing about it is I think that, we went through a period, particularly in the 90s in Europe, where we started to lose sort of faith in community fundraising. We weren't interested in it. We saw it as labor intensive. And now what I think is that people have realized that they've made a big mistake by pulling away from community, because community fundraising is the very heart of community. It's people to people. It's actually about, people taking action, bringing people together to do something good. And I think the thing for me, which is interesting now, is as we start to look at all these sophisticated methods that the sort of the digital age brings us, we can now see community manifest itself in so many other ways. And people need to belong, people need to connect, people need recognition. I mean, all the human needs that we have are met by communities. We live in communities, we work in communities, we trade in communities, we share in communities. And I think that charities actually have not put enough focus on community. I mean, they haven't looked at all the emerging manifestations of community. They haven't realized the power of this. I mean, again, let me go back to Europe. And I mean, in Europe, one of the things that's interesting is that as the direct marketing bubble started to burst at the sort of, a few years ago in Europe, and now sort of cold recruitment, a bit like North America in many ways, is almost a no-go in many areas. It's very, very hard and very, very tough and very high risk. And therefore, a lot of these charities are now falling back onto linking their community sort of fundraising activities as a way of driving people through different channels to connect them into other programs. One of the things we're always looking for, and one of the other big myths of fundraising nowadays, is integrated fundraising. Do you have the ability, do you have the creativity, do you have the strategic sense to be able to hover above a portfolio of fundraising and look at how each method can actually fuel the next method, how you get the crossover between different messaging and different mechanisms and different channels? The smart charities now, they break down the barriers. We're not discipline-led. We truly are looking at the needs of those stakeholders out there. And community is one of those classic ones. So carrying on, I mean, I can see that on the slides you've brought up one of the sort of the models that I've been working on. And one of the things about this is you can see, if you look at the left-hand side, where it says geographical community, I guess that's where I started 32 years ago. You were in an area, and in that area you had communities. But now, of course, you've also got these other ones, if you move across, where you've got communities of concern. I mean, look at the breast cancer movement, look at Lance Armstrong, look at the HIV/AIDS movement. All of these movements are movements of concern. People belong to these communities because they want to change something. Communities of culture, where nowadays we all live in multicultural societies, and these different cultures want to connect to their cultures of origin. They actually know the diaspora fundraising, the heritage fundraising. These are sort of givens. There's also on the other side, which actually is missing on the slide, but the other one is communities of interest. And communities of interest is that nowadays, no matter what you're interested in, how bizarre it is, how dynamic it is, how weird, whatever, you've just got to go on the internet and you'll find other people. And it doesn't matter where they are, which country they're in, you build communities of interest. Now, if you look at those 4 types of community, and then you look at some of these surrounding words. Some of these communities are physical, you're actually meeting people. Some of them are virtual, using the web. Some of them are close to you, some of them more remote. Some of them are occasional, some of them are regular. Now, when you begin to see this, what you're seeing is that there's actually sort of a wealth of opportunity to actually think, well, what are the communities I should be connecting to? Where's my cause going to fit in? Who are the people who are going to actually sort of really want to sort of pick up that engagement, pick up that baton and give? And one of the examples I've built into this, and if you look down on the slide underneath communities of culture, you could also then come into niche communities. And I've mentioned diaspora, but I mean, now I'm seeing a lot of very gender-specific fundraising. I mean, in America, you've got the American Red Cross with their Tiffany Circle, which is all driven by women, very much gender-specific fundraising. You've then also got sexuality, where within the gay communities now, you see them sort of basically, building their own charities, selecting their own causes. You see every major city in the world now has gay pride and how these things work. Belief has always been there. So, to be honest, Andrew, I could go on and on because I hope you can detect the passion I feel that says that community is an inadequate word, because now to get underneath community, you have a wealth of opportunities for charities to reach out and connect. This will fuel your creativity to say, what new programs, what new propositions do I need to get to these people? And when we talk about the fundraising cycle in a few minutes' time, then actually we'll sort of connect this into that area as well.
Yeah. It's so interesting for me to look at this, Tony, because of course, when I'm about your age and when I started in this business, this really, the community meant who was geographically next door to you, right? Who was supporting the hospital in your community in that sense. And now it's to the point where we have so many ways of communicating with one another and feeling close to one another, even at a great divide, even though we are hundreds of thousands of miles away sometime, that the sense of barrier have really gone away as we can select.
I mean, leaping in, Andrea, one of the things I'd just add in on that, just as your thinking goes, see, when I talk about the word community, I mean, Seth Godin, who, I'm sure many of us are big fans of his thinking. And I mean, Seth is completely obsessed with this idea of tribes and this idea that people need to belong to tribes. And I quite like that because, in North America, you speak to anybody about sport. I mean, I'm not a great sports person myself, but it enriches so many people's lives. And therefore, people, you see this tribalism, this passion that people have, and it's extreme passion, it's extreme tribalism. And that's what we need to actually get people to be like with us. So, tribes is another concept which I quite like. Whatever sort of makes you think differently about these groups of people and meeting their needs. It's from them, you see, that's the thing. Yes, we've got all the data mining tools and segmentation, but these are different communities, which really excites me.
Yeah, for those of you on the call who don't know the work of Seth Godin, that's Godin, Seth is his first name, Godin is his last name. He's written a whole host of books on this notion of tribes and being remarkable and looking at things from the perspective of people selecting you rather than you're pushing your message to them. It's well worth reading. It has huge application to fundraising. So if you haven't, you can sign up for his blog. It comes daily. It's one of the few blogs I read every day, and I'm seldom disappointed. Tony, you probably read him every day too.
Yeah, he's one of only 3 I read every single day religiously. I'm a big fan. I've had the pleasure of being in contact with Seth, and his thinking is so diverse. I mean, he's also, I guess, as part of all the sort of things he talks about, he goes right back to when he really coined permission marketing, and this idea of how we actually enter people's lives. And for those of you who follow one of my other favorite blogs, The Agitator, it's ironic because that's what they've been talking about today as well.
Right. So it really is worth. I mean, the application to fundraising, it's you don't have to apply very far. It's right there. Let's talk now a little, Tony, about how you look at segmenting donors. I pulled the slide from a presentation that you have given. You gave some time ago and perhaps continue to give it. But I thought it was really pretty interesting. It used to be that when we looked at donors, we were looking for donors that had wealth and that had the interest and capacity to give, and that was about the way we segmented them. Right? That's a far
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
cry from the picture here.
I think the big thing for me is that what you're looking at here, this is just one slide in isolation, so it's always difficult for anybody looking at this to wonder what on earth I'm on about. But this is about looking at the actual donor and stepping outside your normal comfort zone, because we spend our lives in charities, sat in offices, sat in our cubicles, trying to work out what our needs are as charities. What's the case for support? What's the proposition? What's the mailing? What's the newsletter? And so on and so on. But what these words are, when you see the word needs, that's not the needs of the charity. That's the needs of the person you're talking to. Because you see, the thing I think nowadays is that so much of what we teach in fundraising is hygiene. Learning the techniques. To be quite honest, I could teach most people the techniques of fundraising, but it's the added value, it's that extra layer, and that starts from leaving your data tools behind, leaving your comfort zone behind, and starting to say, what does the donor need? What do I need to satisfy the donor? Why do donors give? And I've been a great believer for several years now that, when people talk about asking for money, I don't actually believe in asking for money. I think the point about it is it's about saying what you're doing is you're offering something, not asking for something. You're offering people the chance to connect to their values, to express their sense of the world, to do something that is good for them. And you see, I think by doing good for them, then they do good for others. And I think this is a psychological thing. We've all been there when it comes to board governance. And I know that, your webinar next month, you've got the wonderful Simone talking about boards, and she'll talk wonderfully about this. I adore her. But the big thing for me about the way that we go about this is that when you train board members, they always talk about, I can't ask for money, and it just doesn't feel right. But you see, the psychology of giving is that you have to think that you're giving more than you're asking for, because in this world we live in, people need to make sense of the world, and therefore understanding their needs. And you see that as the first sort of thing, and there's a whole cluster of thinking around that, which is well worth anybody spending time on, because this is the more advanced fundraising to me. I mean, I get fed up with the basic stuff because it's not that interesting nowadays because everybody does it. And then, of course, when you think about their needs, you have to think about this sort of thing about the emotions. You see, when I think about human beings in terms of giving, I always think about head, heart, and spirit. So the head is all the rational reasons, which charities spend far too long on. Then the heart is all the emotional reasons. What is that connection that you're making? What is that empathy? What is that sort of, what makes them happy? What makes them sad? All those things. And then, of course, the spirit is not a spiritual thing as in, the belief system. It's more about the spirit of the times. It's the zeitgeist. It's how people see the world, how people want to see the world. And I think this is a very important factor for charities now, is how do you sort of show people that they can make sense of things, they can make a difference? How do you make people feel good about themselves and what they're doing? And these are the things. So when you look at that thing, emotions, I mean, this is about understanding this sort of makeup of the modern supporter and donor. And actually, if you look around at the commercial sector, is spending billions of dollars every year in North America, they're playing with the same things. You look at the way they advertise now, you look at the way they service people, connect to people, the propositions. They're going way beyond the techniques. They're now actually really focusing on what's happening inside the head, the heart, and the spirit of people. And I guess, finishing a quick view down on the other sort of three figures in this diagram, I mean, the life stage, I think, is absolutely critical, because you see, the other thing about this is that we rely so heavily on our databases, but our databases are a bit like a black hole in many ways, because once a donor goes in there, then they're in a machine, they get the mailings, they do this, and we only change our responses to them based on their recency, frequency, value on the whole, and that's a big generalism. But you see, the thing for me is life stage. If I could have one piece of data beyond the basic contact data, it would always be date of birth, because this is something the sector's wrestled with for so long, but now the technology helps us much more about, what life experiences that people have, what's their value base, what have they grown up with. I mean, this is talked about quite a bit, but in my view, not enough, because your life stage dictates the lifestyle. It dictates the way you give. It tells you whether you're time poor, time rich, cash poor, whether you want to exercise voice, influence, all the things that people give. But it's all about the life stage, and that's why that's such an important thing. And then, of course, I could go on about the segments, but I suspect we should probably move on from there. But the thing for me about this is that these 5 little mannequins in front of you are nothing to do with the charity. They're all to do with thinking about the donor, the supporter, or indeed the community that you want to reach. Put yourself in their shoes. And that actually now is about modern marketing. We've got so smart at learning this stuff. I mean, we know it. We've become qualified. The CFRE's on this call. You've got the qualifications. This is going beyond that. This is the added value which is going to unlock those donors. But above all, once you've unlocked them, it's about locking them into you as the preferred brand or preferred partner to change parts of the world.
Right, great, thank you. That's really interesting to look at this and to see what's available to us and how the technology will support us in this, how much more complicated and how much richer it is than it was to even 10 years ago. You have, Tony, a really interesting version of the fundraising cycle. And anyone who has been in fundraising for a while is used to a variety of cycles. They're sort of simple cycles. The old ones looked like, identify donors, cultivate donors, ask donors, thank them, inform them, identify them. You just go around a very simple cycle. And the cycle you've come up with, and we'll spend now quite a number of slides on this, looks quite different. It really intrigued me, because I think it's a cycle that is much more donor-oriented than it's organization-oriented. You have here 8 steps. They go around in a figure 8, and I've put together a slide for each of them. So maybe you want to just give a little introduction to how you came up with that, and then we'll move through all 8 pieces.
Sure. I mean, just as a bit of an overview, Andrew, I mean, you're absolutely right. I love fundraising. Whenever you any fundraising conference, it's impossible to escape pyramids, cycles, and all these other wonderful things that we like to surround ourselves with. So I'm glad we've got a cycle and not a pyramid. The thing for me is that when I became a fundraiser, one of the first important pieces of learning I was given, and in those days, there wasn't the sort of Institute of Fundraising, so you had to learn from other consultants and gurus at the time. And there was a wonderful fundraiser in the UK called Redmond Mullin, and Redmond Mullin had become a fundraiser in the 1960s, and he wrote a book which basically said the fundraising cycle has got 4 stages. It's got the need, the audience, the strategy, the evaluation, and you start again. So he had 4 sort of words. And if you think about the logic of it, for many years, that has been my survival. So no matter how difficult the challenges that I've been set, no matter how hard I found it, when I look at those 4 words, I've always been able to go back and decide what's not working, where do I need to go? Is it the need? Am I not drilling hard enough to define the dimensions of the need? Is it the audience? Am I connecting to the right people? Have I been too ambitious? Have I got it wrong? Am I using the wrong strategy, the wrong technique? Where should I be going? And have I done enough evaluation? And the more I thought about these 4 words which sat across the top circle, the more I just thought, wow, that really, so many of us in Europe, we wrote our strategies based on those 4 stages, because no matter how simple they were incredibly powerful. So a few years ago, I started playing around with this, and before Redmond died, spent some time with him, sort of talking about the fact of, those 4 stages nowadays are not enough for the modern world. Now we need much more. So the thing that you're looking at here is my latest manifestation, and it's also one that I will evolve every year. I will keep changing these words, because every one time you change the word, you change people's thinking. I'm a great believer in changing the lexicon to make people think differently, change the language of fundraising, reinvent fundraising, because we have to keep refreshing. We must never sort of like lock in thinking we know what these things mean. And the two circles you see, as you say, they're a figure of 8. You start at 1 and you go all the way down to the right-hand side and through the bottom and back up to the top. But what's interesting is your comment about they're much more about the donor, because in actual fact, they're not. They're actually 50-50. The top circle is the organizational cycle. The bottom circle in orange is the donor cycle. And when you put the two together, when they're actually, if people can imagine, if you can see that they're done as two cogwheels, as the top wheel moves, it will automatically lock in and make the bottom wheel move. So, you know, on my original one, and I know we can't do all these wonders on the sort of the webinar, but I mean, on my original one, you're constantly looking at this figure of 8 rotating and moving. So it's pushing you through each of these stages. And the final thing I just say on an overview is the point about the cycle is wherever you are on the cycle, you always keep going back through different stages. So the stories, which we'll talk about in a second, when that used to be need, it meant that the fundraiser always had to revisit the need, because the minute you lose sight of everything being needs-led, then actually you start to lose focus as to what you're really trying to communicate in fundraising. Because too many fundraisers, certainly historically, have been obsessed with what was number 3, the technique and the strategy. We spent too long in that because that was the fun bit. Then we learned we had to go back to the audience, which was what number 2 was. But now what the cycle is saying to you is that you've got no choice but to keep going back through the key stages we're about to talk about.
Well, let's jump right into stories.
Well, I think the thing for me is that, again, I'm playing with words here, let's be honest. I mean, you know, whether you take number 1 as the need or whether you take it as stories doesn't matter, because stories is the modern way that we communicate the need. And even as I say that, I can feel myself cringing a little bit, because it does amuse me greatly now that on the fundraising sort of education circuit, everybody wants to talk about the latest thing, stories. But of course, stories are far from the latest thing. They're probably the oldest thing that mankind actually has, because it's the way we've always communicated with passion and to get people to connect. So stories to me is about how do you look at all the different dimensions to, you know, your job as a fundraiser is to challenge the organization, to, you know, try and translate it. You're a translator. You're the bridge between the organization, the beneficiaries, and the donor. So what are you going to arm yourself with? And the best thing you can arm yourself with is stories.
Then we move here to connection.
Well, connection to me is about who are you going to connect with. I mean, it's a bit like the target side of it that you talked about. And I think it's about saying that, you know, who are your audiences? Because you're not going to appeal to everybody. You're actually only going to appeal to a sort of, you know, a select number of people, aren't you? Very few causes in the world now can reach out to everyone. So this is about saying choose your connection wisely, because in the modern world of marketing, you have to be laser-like in your focus. And again, when you think about connections also nowadays, we need to go back to that community thinking. That community thinking which basically says, well, you know, if we reach out to one person, how can we multiply that contact? How can we actually, you know, go to the most powerful method of marketing that's ever been known to mankind, and that's word of mouth. Because that's where everybody's going. All the social media, all that sort of sea of things out there which provide wonderful, wonderful opportunities, it's all about creating word on the street, word in communities, word between people. So once you've got those stories, who are you going to tell them to? That's the big thing. Who are you going to connect to? And the more imaginative you are, the more you break away from the pack. Too many of us keep going to the same old people. You know, the same companies, the same foundations, you know, we're all fighting with each other. We've got to break out. You know, in marketing, you either grow a customer or you steal a customer. And that's true in fundraising. You know, are you actually going to reach out and find places where you can grow different sort of donor segments, grow a different approach to it, or are you just going to be basically trying to poach donors away from other causes?
Tony, it's interesting to hear you talk about this. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is how to overlay people's influence, people's ability to influence others onto what we know about their resources. Right? In the fundraising world, we've looked again and again at how much money people have. We're pretty sophisticated at finding that out. But of course, now it becomes just as important to find out how much influence people have with other people, right? Who can they bring into our organizations?
You see,
So
I
we have a
think
whole different level to think about that.
I think to me that's a really, critical point, Andrea, because obviously one of the big growth areas, and there's a revolution going on in the whole area of high net worth individuals. I mean, you can't call this major giving anymore, and you have to basically focus on the high net worth individuals. And every program I run, no matter which country I'm in, I always work on a 70-30 rule, and people say, well, what is that? And that is 70% of what you get from a high net worth individual is the gift. 30% of what you get from the high net worth individual is the influence. So we've always known that. That's how we built the great universities of America. But the big thing for me is that this is formalizing it more to say, don't just come back with the gift, because the gift isn't enough anymore, because we don't have the resources to do it gift by gift. We have to constantly think that every contact point, if we take longer in the cultivation, if we're smarter in the stewardship, if we delight the donor, then what we're really going to do is we're then going to start to open up that 30% box. And I mean, I think that's a really very, very tough call, because it means that we're having to really say to our boards, this might take longer than you think, because we're working on a 70-30 rule.
That's interesting. I've never heard it. I've never heard it expressed that way, but it makes very good sense to me. Let's move on to inspiration, and which is right in this diagram, right at the center anyway.
Well, it's the one that gets two
What's
numbers, so
your
we're going to go
what's your
back
thought
through it
here?
twice. The thing for me
Yeah.
about inspiration is that, you see, you could put several words here if you were just looking at the top circle, because the thing is once you've got your story and you know who you want to connect it to, probably one of the most relevant sort of mechanical words is channel. What channel are you going to use? The managing channels nowadays in modern fundraising is critical. But you see, even channels is a bit of a hygiene thing for me, because to me it's about what's that moment of inspiration that you're going to put out there to draw people in. What's the headline? What's the picture? What's the proposition? What's that sort of whole approach and the way your organization comes across? How does your brand play out? And you see, this is all about inspiring the donor. You see, I think we have to realize nowadays that using words like recruiting donors, dreadful word. You recruit people to test drive new Chevrolets. You recruit people to the army. I mean, are we recruiting people to the army? And of course we're not. This is the insanity of this language that we use. We become prisoners of our lexicon. You see, our job is to inspire people. We have to lay this out in front of them, inspire them to step forward, to step over the threshold. Because you see, the bottom circle as we go through is once you've inspired people, the journey begins. This is the beginning of the journey, and you don't begin the journey with recruitment. I mean, you really don't. And this is the thing that we're so hung up on. We're so much, we're becoming technicians. And I'm afraid that is very short-lived, and it's not going to be the modern fundraising we're going to see in another 5 or 10 years' time.
It's interesting to go back to Seth Godin's language. Seth talks about superpower. What's your superpower? And he talks about being remarkable, not just trying to get your message out, but actually having the core of what you do be something that other people will want to get involved in and want to talk about. And that, I think, in part overlays with what you're talking about here with inspiration.
Yeah, I really do believe that, because you see, I think also, we mustn't underestimate this changing dynamic in terms of the demographic shifts that go on. I don't want to take us backwards on that, but I mean, when we talk about some of the new giving generations, and I'm not just talking about the youngsters, I'm talking about, people in their 30s, and, these people are now, they're taking control of their philanthropy, they're taking control of their giving. I really believe they want to give, I believe they can give and will give, but you see, they don't want to be recruited. It's on their terms. It's it's their world. They're in control. We're all in control nowadays. So you see, the thing for me is about what a charity should focus on is that word. That one word is a lifetime challenge. How do you constantly inspire people to take a look, to connect, to make you the charity of choice. Because, you know, there's so many causes, there's so many organizations, and actually, you know, we have to compete in marketing terms, and I don't want to compete on recruitment because it feels wrong to me. So actually, everything I do now around the world is I compete on inspiration.
Right. I love that. How about engagement? Do you compete on engagement as well?
Well, in many ways, yeah, because it goes back to the channels and all the things. You know, there's never been a better time to be a fundraiser. I know that's a cliche. I don't care, and I'm not apologizing. You see, the thing for me is that we've got the most amazing tools that we couldn't have dreamt of. And therefore, how do you engage people? You know, where are you starting to, you know, test out what does that donor do? You know, what do they want? What channel do they want? What style of communications do they want? You know, how visual do they want it? How much do they want to be able to touch it, feel it? You know, how much do they want to experience it? Or how much do they want to do it more from a distance so they can actually start to do it more on their terms? So the thing for me is, you know, this is where the donor journey really starts to step up, because of course we all know the horrifying statistics of the number of donors who give one gift and never give again. And you know, that's a disease in North America as it is in Europe. You know, we've got this problem where people, they're not even shopping around, they're giving once, and then is it their issue that they don't give again, or is it our problem we're not engaging people? You see, we've got to get to the next stage, which is a conversation, but you've got to engage people. So, you know, what are we doing to make these people feel part of a community, part of a tribe? What are we doing to show that we care about them and it's not just about us and the next newsletter? You know, to me, newsletters should be put in the museum in the middle of Washington. I mean, you know, these things are like dinosaurs. I mean, where's the good ones? I haven't found them, and I go around the world looking for the damn things.
What have you found for engagement tools that you think is among the best of the best?
Well, you know, I mean, there's so many things. We could have a whole webinar just on that. But I mean, you know, just as we were talking before we came onto this session, I mean, in the UK at the moment, and I know this is dictated by the sort of the technology, but I mean, mobile giving has really taken off. I mean, we're learning how to convert mobile givers from a one-off text donation into a regular gift. We're then actually giving people an option to actually have their whole stream of communication through their mobile device. Because, you know, people don't carry mobile phones anymore, do they? It's a mobile wallet, it's a mobile address book, it's a mobile life. There's nothing you can't do from that sort of, you know, that Android or that Apple. I mean, you can do everything. So that's just one small, tiny example. And if you're sat in America thinking, oh, yeah, but it's different here, no, it's not, and it won't be. It's just a matter of when. It's not a matter of if.
Yeah, you know, I've often thought, and I don't think our sector yet uses it well, but that if you have an iPhone and simply go out into the field that you're serving and start snapping pictures, right, and email them, text them to people who are your donors who want to be engaged, it goes a long way. And people do very little of that yet. They should. It's so easy and so effective. Let's move on to yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, you know, and I think, you know, that's, I just want to emphasize, you know, obviously I've picked on that mobile thing, but there's so many other ways to do it. And you know, I think this thing about just that very word engagement, it's about getting the team together, sitting down and saying what's right for you. Because the other thing I would just say to you is, you know, if you're a small not-for-profit, you're in a small shop, you're in a better position. Don't think this is for the big players, because the big players take a long time to turn around to this. So you could be in a much stronger position to make this part of your fundraising and be unique about it. So I would really encourage people to look at this hard and think that even if you're a one-person shop, this could be your distinct advantage.
Right. Yes, I love what you talk about, Tony, in terms of having the language that inspires. I mean, just thinking about inspiration, thinking about engagement, sort of opens my mind. It gets my pulse going faster, and I think it does everybody else's too. Let's talk for a few minutes about the conversation, number 5 here.
Well, conversation, I love this word because, you know, it's one of those words that I'm not sure we've really thought about in fundraising before. You know, it's this idea of, we always talk about the sort of the whole stewardship and the engagement cycle. But you see, nowadays, we have to realize that there's so many more ways that people want a two-way dialogue. I mean, conversation is about dialogue, not a monologue. And therefore, that has to be, as you put on the slide, the tipping point. You know, this isn't going to be for all donors. I mean, on this journey we have, a lot of your donors are going to stick at inspiration. You know, a few more will trickle through to engagement. I mean, if this was the inevitable pyramid, we're moving up to the smaller numbers. But the donors who really are engaged in the issue and you've actually sort of captured them, then they're going to want a conversation. They want to actually have a dialogue with you. So how do you do that? You know, how do you encourage them to share their thoughts? How do you encourage them to come back to you? And how do you actually communicate where you're not always communicating with a financial ask? You know, this is about being braver. You know, we have to deprioritize money, and that's not something you'd expect a global fundraiser to say, but you do. Because if you do other things right, the money will follow, and you have to believe in that, because we're too fixated with basically hitting people too quickly, too hard for the gift. And that's short-termism.
So, so I do have to ask you, when I look at this image of yours, and I'm sure Brian is wondering the same thing, given that our company, Brian's company, is Asking Matters, where does asking fit here?
But you see, that's the thing. I mean, asking is almost implicit throughout the whole thing. I mean, asking is about, you know, everything you're doing here, you're keeping an opening for people to give. Now, at specific times, you take control of that. So obviously, the inspiration is an ask. The way that people make their first sort of step over the threshold is most of the time by giving a gift. And then, of course, the engagement is that they're actually sort of, you know, organizing their giving, hopefully into a regular system. The conversation is when you might be having a conversation about a lifetime gift. You might be moving more into planned giving as opposed to annual giving. So in a way, you don't need to have a thing which says this is where the asking happens or that, because, of course, as you say, Andrea, you know, if you're talking about a major giving cycle, we all know about, you know, the idea of identifying, qualifying, and all those things. And that's absolutely right for that particular segment. But this is a higher strategic framework, and asking and the giving is implicit throughout, in my view.
Yes, yes, thank you. That's great. Belonging. I particularly liked this one. I have to say, this was I think belonging is so important to everybody, and we don't think about it well enough in fundraising. So I love that you included this.
I used to call this loyalty, and loyalty was my last edition of this, but then I realized that loyalty is such a precious commodity, and it's a very rare commodity, that perhaps we've been overstretched ourselves. So I've pulled it back to belonging, because you see, to me, one of the things which I see in society around the world is that movements are back in fashion. People want to, you know, they want to associate with movements. They want to feel they belong to things that are trying to do good, belong to things that are actually, you know, part of their lives. And I think that's an interesting thing for me. So rather than expecting loyalty from a donor, how do you make them feel that they belong? You know, it's not that every month they sit down and they work out who they're going to send the check to. You're just a natural part of their life. I mean, people often say to me, what's the ultimate sort of advice you give to a fundraiser? And I'd say, you know, make your cause part of somebody's life. It feels natural. You're part of the family. They're part of your family. Now, that's an aspiration at the very tip of the pyramid. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you can push many people through to this stage, but let's be honest, you know, it's not even the 80-20 principle anymore. Nowadays, 95% of the income of most charities comes from 5% of the donors. So those 5%, I want to be at number 6.
Right.
Right.
That's right. Exactly. So now here we are back at the core, back at the heart of this, and let's move on here from that to appreciation.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not going to let you off on that, Andrea, because
Okay,
I just want to say one quick word. You see, the thing for
please.
me is inspiration. You go through twice, because I want to say to everybody out there, you never stop inspiring, because you never take a donor for granted. Just because they're in and they're giving doesn't mean to say you're inspiring them. You know, lots of people set up a bank draft, and they send you their money, and you kid yourself that they're being loyal, but they're not. They just haven't bothered to cancel. You're not inspiring them to keep moving them up, to keep them engaged. So, you know, you have to keep on to the existing donors as much as the new ones. You know, this is why fundraising is the hardest job in the world. You know, you want an easy job, join the commercial sector, because you're not going to find it in our sector.
Right.
Okay, now you can do number 8.
Thank you for stopping me on that. That was great. Appreciation.
I guess, you know, this is the classic thing about, I mean, appreciation is about how do you evaluate constantly. This is the value of data. I mean, all the tools we have now, you know, we must never take them for granted. Sometimes I'm a bit too glib about them, because I absolutely value them at every level. Anything that's going to give you insight, anything that's going to help you understand. And of course, we should appreciate and evaluate failure as much as success. You know, this is fail forward faster territory. The more you fail, the more successful you are, because it means you're in motion. And therefore, any charity who doesn't fail on a reasonably frequent basis is because they're not pushing to the edge and looking over. They're not pushing hard enough. And I guess the other big thing is this constant thing about, thinking about how can you surprise and delight the donor. That's what I mean by this stewardship word. I mean, stewardship was one of, again, the old words from the Bible, but I mean, I love it, and it's great, and it works for me. And then, of course, when you finish number 8, guess where you go to? You go back to number 1, you dig deeper for new stories, new dimensions, and you keep going. This is hamster in a figure of 8 where you never stop cycling.
Right. I love the idea that we can tell stories, and some of the more compelling stories are not just about the people we serve, but are also about our donors and why they're engaged and what delights them, and how they are a part of our family, right? So the
Absolutely.
stories are partly about your mission and your vision and what you're accomplishing, and partly about the people who are in your family to make that happen. So that makes every cycle of your figure 8 even richer and fatter and fuller. So I think a very useful set of language, and a very useful cycle. Uh, Tony, our time is, we have about 10 minutes left, and in that time, I'd like to ask you some sort of more personal questions, I suppose, a little less theoretical and a little more personal. You have had a very rich and interesting life, probably broader and with many more experiences than many of us have had. If you were to sort of pull that back to 3 life lessons you've learned, what would you pick out?
I mean, my life lessons
Can
are
you
all
do
going to
that?
be around fundraising. I mean, even though I now am on the dark side of consulting, I see myself very much as a fundraiser. Fundraising is what I'm passionate about. And my 3 big lessons, I guess, and this is always a hard one, but I mean, number 1 is about the people side. I mean, I take my inspiration from people. Fundraising is about connecting to people, and therefore, always look for the good in people. I mean, I always start, no matter how hard a donor is, no matter how hard a community is, believing the best. You've got to find it. So that would be number 1. I guess number 2 for me is also about simplicity. It's that wonderful sort of Einstein thing, isn't it, about seeking simplicity. You have to go through complexity to seek simplicity. And the more I look at the world nowadays, and our technology, whilst it's incredibly sophisticated and complex, the thing that everybody's seeking is simplicity in the way it works and the way it just feels natural. And that's what you have to do with your fundraising. It has to feel simple. Your job is to go through the complexity to get to that stage. So I'd always seek simplicity in things. And then I guess the next thing for me, which is maybe the more radical one, and maybe I'm very privileged to be able to say it, but I'm a great believer in breaking the rules. Teach me the rules and I'll teach you how to break them. Because you see, I'm not talking about anything which goes against any ethical or moral codes, of course not. But if we all follow each other and nobody ever breaks away from the pack, we don't make any progress. We all owe it to each other to actually take other ideas and move beyond. And sometimes we have to break the rules to do that. I think that's the interesting thing. Look at some of these, when a cause suddenly pops up and you can say, wow, where did that come from? That's amazing. And it's because it's broken some rules. So we mustn't always conform, and we mustn't always play it safe. Yes, you're employed with donors' money, but your job is to take risk. Your job is to actually go further than you're meant to go, because that's the only way we can even begin to mobilize resources the not-for-profit sector needs.
Yes, I just a couple of comments, Tony, on the issue of simplicity. Do you know that wonderful image that shows a strand of spaghetti going into a big bowl of spaghetti, and then a strand of spaghetti coming out the other end? Do you know
I do.
that? There's a wonderful image. And I mean, I go back to that again and again, because often we start out with something that seems so simple, and we have to go through this complicated, confusing sort of spaghetti moment before we can pull the thread out the other end, and again it looks simple. I often think about that in my life and in my business practice. So um, I'm happy to have you talk about that. And when you talk about breaking the rules, just a little while ago you talked about, I think you referred to failing forward faster.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you said?
I did.
Fail forward faster? right? I
Yep.
thought that was a wonderful phrase, and goes right along with breaking the rules. You have to be willing to fail forward, to fail, to risk failure, I think, in order to break the rules. And that's where remarkable things happen. I think many people in the nonprofit world feel stuck, and it's terrific to have you encourage some of the people on this call to actually have the will and have the courage to try new things, to explore new things in new directions. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Let me move one more slide here. These are some of the people who are on this call. These are some of our Asking Matters members. I wonder if you can come up with just a couple pieces of very simple, practical advice for them.
I
You were in
guess
their shoes as development director of a community organization. That's where many of these people are.
I mean, I guess what I would hope is that, there's sort of bits of advice that people have been able to sort of pull out so far. And therefore, I think maybe the missing link is about yourself as an individual. And this is always where you sort of risk being a little bit too cheesy, as we would say. But you see, the big thing for me is that, fundraising is an amazing sort of discipline, and it is very, very hard. And you have to sort of not only put up with, the knockbacks, but you also have to live a life where you'll never have enough time, you'll never have enough budget, and people are always putting under pressure. So, you have to continually invest in yourself. I mean, the fact that people are listening to this now is investing in themselves. And I think it's about finding that inner energy, and it's about, looking for that passion, because the more you can do that yourself, the more that will come across in the way you write, the way you speak, the way you connect. I always say to any fundraiser that when you're in front of a donor, you are the organization you represent, because you're the manifestation of it. So how you come across, how you act, how you, communicate, everything is a embodiment of the brand. So as much as we've talked a lot about strategic things and thinking and gone on a journey, never forget the importance of yourself, and never give up on that constant journey of, personal development and sort of taking care of yourself, because that's tough. That really is tough. I really say to people, if you don't have that energy and passion, then stay in bed that day. Not that I have in the last 32 years, but that's just a piece of thinking.
Right. I love that advice. I think it's fantastic. I so agree with you that how each of us feels and what we communicate leads to what results we get, and it is a difficult world, and a difficult business, because we're pushed and pulled by so many factors that feel beyond us. Thank you for that. It's really wonderful fundraiser advice. Tony, what's your favorite fundraising resource? You have a book or a newsletter or something else that you is really your go-to?
My quick answer to that would actually be, if I want my favorite fundraising resource, it wouldn't be a fundraising resource. I look for inspiration in other industries. I look for inspiration in trends. I'm a big trend watcher. I look for trends in the way people are living their lives, the way people are interacting, the way people shop, the way people communicate. We spend too long looking at the fundraising world, and we don't break outside. I have this mantra which is about use windows, not mirrors, because the answers are outside your offices, not inside your offices. If you push me on my fundraising resource, having been a little bit sort of tricksy on that, I mean, I love things like The Agitator every day with Roger Craver, and I think that's great. I love the people that we all know that we talk about. I love sort of catch up with what they're doing. Great thinkers in our sector, people that are mutual friends to your organisation and mine. And then I guess I'd put up one other quick one, which I think is critical, and that's Sofii, SOFII, which is a charitable website, which is the Museum of Fundraising. And it's totally free. And if people haven't ever gone there, it's like going into a museum and looking at all the great fundraising of the last 30 years. And it's new exhibits every day. And Ken Burnett's behind that, and that works really well for me.
Great. And your favorite project at the moment? I know you have many of them. Is there one that particularly lights you up?
Well, I guess, I would probably say my favourite project is always the one I'm actually in the middle of or working on at that moment. And at the moment, I'm sat here talking to you from New York, and I'm in the offices of the International AIDS Vaccine Institute or Initiative. And the big thing for me is that, that project at the moment is very inspiring, trying to work out a new way of, presenting aids and the sort of the need to actually get that sort of next step of the journey to getting a vaccine. So how do you guide an organization in probably one of the hardest areas of fundraising, which is case of support? You know, anyone who's worked out there on that, they know it's harder than finding the donors.
Right, right. And finally, how would you like our people to remember you?
I guess I would just go back on some of those words. You know, my heart and my soul is in this profession. There's enough people out there championing the cause. I want to be a champion for fundraising, not for itself, but for what it can achieve. We need to be proud to be fundraisers. We are heroes. We can't ever say that, but it's actually saying that, you know, let's really believe in that stuff.
Right.
Great.
Tony, you have been an inspiration.
Yes.
Really an inspiration that has such a unique and different voice. I think you make us all stand back and look at ourselves a little differently, stand a little taller, sit a little taller, be a little more excited. I thank you so, so very much for being with us
Yes.
today. It's been really a treat to work with you on this. Um, Brian, we have
Yes.
one more slide.
Yes.
You want to do this?
Sure. Well, we hope you'll join us for another one of the true masters, Simone Joyaux. Some of you have heard her before at Asking Matters 2 years back. She is a super expert on boards and has a unique and interesting take on them and what we should expect from them. And we all are challenged by our boards. So I hope you will join us Wednesday, October 30th for the next Fundraising Master Series. Of course, for the premium members on the call, this is free to you for those of you who joined us for Tony's from outside our membership. We hope you'll join us for this one as well. Tony, we had one quick question. I'm just going to ask it before we sign off. Someone asked if you know Malcolm Gladwell, since you talk about agitators and thought leaders. Do you know him?
I do know
Or
Malcolm. Yeah,
mm-hmm.
fabulous. I mean, you know, again,
Yeah.
think about all the things we've said. I'm glad somebody got that in their head. You know, blinking and tipping and all those other things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the thing about Malcolm is simplicity. He's the
Yep.
master of it. I mean, and also he can write a whole book on one simple concept, and he can stretch it out beyond anybody else I know. But that's not a bad thing. It's
Right.
not a bad
Right.
thing.
And then he
And he can
distills it
make
back
anything
down. Right.
yeah, he can make anything fascinating. I once read a very
Yes.
long article that he wrote for the New Yorker on diapers. I thought if
Yeah.
anyone can write a fascinating
Yes.
article
I
on
read that.
diapers, they can write a
Yes.
fascinating
Yeah.
article on anything.
So, so Tony, I want to thank you. You know, I always make sure I take something away as well. I was listening, and there were three things that I decided would stay on my mind. One, this idea of community as an inadequate word, as we've used it before, and what it means today. Two, Seth Godin's blog. I have been subscribed to it. I unsubscribed because I was overwhelmed, and I'm going to go back to it. And three, this idea of leaving data behind and about the donor. That's something I do talk about a lot, that we often rely too much on data, and the best data we can get is from talking to our donors. So I appreciated your putting that out there. It's something I'm going to reinforce in my work. So always a learning experience for me. Tony, it's been a delight to have you with us today. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for putting it together, and I'll see you in a month. Thank you, everyone, for
Excellent.
being here today. Bye bye.
Thanks, folks.
Bye,
Bye.
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye bye.